in this third in a series of videos on Frankenstein. The first explored the character of Victor and the monster, the second the themes of ambition, death and education. I'm going to look at three key themes within the novel: love, nature and parenthood. Keen to delve more into the murky world of love and sin? Naturally curious to probe the theme of nature and Victor's attitude towards it? Unable to prevent yourself from pondering parenthood? Stay tuned, this is Schofield on Shakespeare.
As stated in my previous videos, Victor is a strange creature who seems to love himself more than anything or anyone else. Remarkably, there are signs that Walton may also love and admire Victor as much as the man does himself, which is saying something. Penning his yearning missives to his sister, whom he complacently notes loves him very much, he confesses that, for my own part, I begin to love him as a brother, and his constant and deep grief fills me with sympathy and compassion. It's important to remember where Walton is when he writes these words. On freezing, icy waters, hundreds of miles away from civilization. And so in these circumstances, all of us are likely to be more attracted to arbitrarily arrived strangers. Nonetheless, his references to his physical appearance and his voice seem to point to an attraction which is not just platonic. Of course, we need to remember Walton's past aspirations. He spent a year trying and failing to be a poet, and so it is perhaps to be expected that such an individual might use quasi-poetic, alliterative phrases such as soul-subduing music in order to describe something as mundane and guttural as another man's voice. Nonetheless, these early, suspiciously homoerotic references foreshadow the broader landscape of the novel, in which expressions of vigorous, vibrant and romantic heterosexual love are conspicuous by their absence. The most obvious example of an unsatisfactory, seemingly asexual pairing is seen in Victor's relationship with his adopted sister cum planned future wife Elizabeth. The pair are formally joined together by Victor's mother on her deathbed. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children." The language emphasises the incestuous nature of the proposition. The union of her children will make her happy, whilst this and other phrases confirm that marriages should have a wider impact than on just two individuals. Their marriage will help Frankenstein's father get over, to some extent, her own death. So whereas the modern reader, imbibed on a remorseless diet of romantic comedy movies and slushy newspaper feature articles, may be inclined to see marriage as the natural consequence of romantic love between two people, the sense here is more that marriage can be a sensible arrangement with wider benefits beyond the future husband and wife. However, even if we accept a different context in which marriage was a more pragmatic affair, Victor's later references to his own feelings towards Elizabeth and their approaching nuptials furthers the impression the discerning reader may have that the leading narrators of the novel may not be suitably equipped to pursue wholehearted, equal, heterosexual love. In the first chapter of Volume 3, Frankenstein's father questions him closely about his feelings towards Elizabeth, putting gentle pressure on him to consider an immediate solemnization of the marriage. Frankenstein confides his feelings frankly to gawping stranger Walton, although not, of course, to his own father. Alas, to me the idea of an immediate union with my Elizabeth was one of horror and dismay. Let us again consider the context here, which must partially, but only partially, explain Victor's stunningly negative and anti-romantic reaction to looming nuptials. He has agreed to create a female monster to become a lifelong companion for his 8-foot dead body parts creation. Such a prospect clearly fills him with dread, hence the metaphorical reference to this deadly weight yet hanging round my neck and bowing me to the ground, which clearly suggests that he feels permanently burdened and dragged down by what he has agreed to do. This is understandable, but nonetheless it doesn't explain Victor's seemingly total lack of sexual desire for his fiancée. Surely a more conventional heterosexual male might have been able to insert a carefully worded subordinate clause within his sentence about feeling overstrained. For example, whilst I longed more than anything for the spiritual and physical delight enabled by marriage to Elizabeth, I could never escape the deadly weight yet hanging around my neck and bowing me to the ground. And indeed, the closer we look at the text, the more questions are raised about Victor's sexuality. Take the dream he has immediately after creating the monster in chapter 5 of volume 1. In this dream he sees Elizabeth in Ingolstadt, kisses her, but when he has kissed her, she seems to transform, and he thought, I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of flannel. Freud wrote that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. If we accept this concept, there is something deeply disturbing here about the transformation of a kissed fiancé into the dead, decomposing body of a mother. Would a psychoanalyst argue that this dream may indicate that Victor is seriously messed up, that although he knows he is expected to express sexual desire for a female, he cannot deal with this, and instead tries to regress into the comfort of the mother-son relationship, something impossible due to the former's death? An alternative interpretation is that Victor's repeated, morbid contact with death has infiltrated and warped his inner consciousness, meaning that, even when faced with vibrant, living, healthy female flesh, he cannot escape the images of all the dead corpses he has fondled and realigned. Or, put otherwise, could his unnatural dabbling with death have fittingly destroyed his own potential to procreate? Even when Victor returns from his female monster building then destroying trip to Scotland, there is never the slightest hint that, in spite of all, he may be looking forward to the consummation of his relationship with Elizabeth. Could it be that, as well as dreading what his monster might attempt, Victor has similar feelings towards sex with his new wife? This interpretation may explain better his curious, especially with hindsight, decision to march off to search for the monster during his wedding night, rather than lovingly protect his new wife within their matrimonial bed. In my first video, I suggested that Victor's abandonment of his wife on their wedding night might suggest that he is not as bright as he thinks he is. Alternatively, could it be that, actually, Victor knew what he was doing and was simply playing for time to desperately put off being expected to perform heterosexually, something which deep within himself he knew he would be unable to do? Of course, this isn't to say that he knew that the second he left his bedroom, the monster would jump in and speedily throttle. I don't think he is that callous. Nonetheless, the curious, fundamentally incestuous nature of their relationship, combined with Victor's repeated asexual references to the two of them, do suggest that however much Victor may love Elizabeth or think he loves Elizabeth, he is terrified and deeply uncomfortable at the thought of their sexual consummation.
To sum up this section exploring the theme of love, Victor's love is primarily for himself, in spite of gush such as, how could you suppose that my first thought would not fly towards those dear, dear friends whom I love, and who are so deserving of my love? Walton also appears to love the loopy scientists, and there are homoerotic undertones to his admiration. It's important to consider the 19th century context of the novel, and it is clear that a couple's love for each other plays a smaller role than would be expected within today's Western world. A marriage has wider consequences beyond the loved-up ones, which needs to be taken into account, i.e. by marrying Elizabeth, Victor is respecting both the wishes of his father and that of his mother on her deathbed. Similarly, Felix's marriage to Safi brings joy to the former's blind father. Finally, in relation to Victor's love for Elizabeth, it is evident that his 2 years spent surrounded only by dead bodies, combined with the incestuous nature of their relationship and perhaps his latent homosexuality, make him terrified at the thought of sexual consummation.
Next theme to plunder: nature. In many ways, Mary Shelley's novel is conventionally romantic in its portrayal of nature as awe-inspiring and unfathomably powerful. Most obviously, but not solely, this is seen in the description of the Alps, scene of Victor's momentous meeting with the monster. The sound of the river raging among the rocks, and the dashing of the waterfalls around, spoke of a power mighty as omnipotence. This description indirectly emphasises the scale of the Alps. In order to produce the dashing sounds, the water from the waterfall must be pounding down vast distances, or, alternatively, must be moving extraordinarily quickly. Similarly, the sound of the river raging emphasises the enormous speed and quantity of the water thundering down the channel. Meanwhile, the personification of omnipotence and the suggestion that nature is similarly all-powerful indirectly confirms Victor's acquired all-too-late knowledge that human beings, in comparison, are impotent. For it is his failure to respect nature and the inherent rules of nature which taints not just Frankenstein's early ventures, but those of Walton as well. Both men in their younger days arrogantly think that they are somehow on a par with nature, or even worse, can take on nature and win. Shelley shows that the consequences of such presumption are cataclysmic. In Volume 1, Chapter 4, the older, ruined Frankenstein recognises the folly of this, as he recalls, "I pursued nature to her hiding places. My limbs now tremble, my eyes swim with the remembrance. But then a resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward." Victor's words conjure up images of a presumptuous human hunter delving, Adam and Eve-esque, into the natural world's forbidden bowels. However, it is his, with the benefit of hindsight, reaction to his past behaviour which sheds most light upon its immorality. His body literally shakes as he recalls what he used to do, whilst he cannot stop his eyes filling with tears. The clear implication is that he is frightened by his own past failure to respect nature, and he knows that he is now being punished severely for it. The same arrogant desire to take on nature is seen in Walton's early proclamations to his sister about his foolish desire to sail through to the North Pole. His rhetorical questions steam with alpha male heat. Why not still proceed over the untamed yet obedient element? What can stop the determined heart and resolved will of man? Element here refers to the natural world, which naively Walton believes can be controlled and directed by particularly resolute human beings. The aim is clearly for human heroism against the odds, of human triumph in a quest for greater knowledge. Within his skewed worldview, the hierarchy is straddled by man-spreading humankind. However, the strength of Victor's later reprimands is aimed to force Walton to reconsider such erroneous arrogance in relation to nature. Hence his hope that the latter will deduce an apt moral from my tale. Victor's ruined state at the beginning of the novel hammers home human vulnerability and the follies of aspiring to know too much about the incomprehensible, omnipotent natural world, whilst emphasising what the consequences can be for those who meddle blasphemously with nature. The novel also shows that nature can have restorative powers for all who show her respect. Overwhelmed by feelings of apprehension returning to Geneva after nearly 6 years in Ingolstadt, where he created then let loose his hideous monster, Victor remains for 2 days in Lausanne by a lake and reveals the waters were placid, all around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the palaces of nature, were not changed. By degrees the calm and heavenly scene restored me. The palaces of nature is an acknowledged quote from a narrative poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, written by a member of Shelley's inner literary circle, Lord Byron. In his poem, he describes the travels of a disillusioned young aristocrat, who at least cannot fail to be enthralled and awed by the scale and power of nature. Above me are the Alps, the palaces of nature, whose vast walls have pinnacled in clouds their snowy scalps, and throned eternity in icy halls of cold sublimity, where forms and falls the avalanche, the thunderbolts of snow. Byron's description of the Alps here is far more detailed than Shelley's, and is more similar to the scene painted later in the novel, prior to the encounter between Victor and the monster in Volume 2, Chapter 2. Nonetheless, in both contexts, the metaphor palaces of nature aims to position nature, not human beings, as the inherent rulers of the universe, and also to show her magnificence and splendour. Provided we recognise this and take time to passively and humbly appreciate, the effect on mental health and well-being can be transformative. Finally, it is ironic that one of the key triggers for Victor implicitly deciding to take on nature occurs when he beholds its extraordinary power. When he was 15, he witnessed the most violent and terrible thunderstorm. On a sudden, I beheld a stream of fire issue from an old and beautiful oak. So soon as the dazzling light vanished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. Whereas in the later 19th century novel, Jane Eyre, Bronte includes a great horse chestnut tree being struck by lightning to symbolise the unnaturalness of Rochester's relationship with Jane. The former remains married to Mad Bertha. In Frankenstein, this event is very much a simple showcasing of the genuine power of nature. It can destroy in a stroke one of its own creations, in this case, a tree which has been alive for hundreds of years. Yet for Victor, this spectacle makes him wonder about how he himself might harness the laws of electricity, rather than forces him to recognise the unattainability of the power of nature. Whereas ordinary, decent, humble human beings such as Elizabeth can contemplate with a serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearance of things, Victor delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Shelley shows that the analytical, systematic pursuit of boundless scientific knowledge can be reprehensible and have dire consequences, especially when it results in investigating and abusing the laws of nature.
To sum up this section exploring nature, the novel emphasises the power and beauty of nature, which can have restorative effects to those who take the time to passively reflect and appreciate. Both Victor and Walton have taken on, or want to take on, the natural world, and Shelley shows the follies of such presumption and arrogance. Finally, it is ironic that a key trigger for Victor deciding to explore how to animate dead body parts is his witnessing of the supreme power of nature via a tree being struck and subsequently destroyed by a lightning strike.
Final theme to explore in this video? Parenthood. In this novel, there is an obvious jarring contrast between Victor's parents' attitude towards parenting and his own towards his own creation. In Chapter 1 of Volume 1, Victor sums up his childhood as he begins to confide in Walton. With this deep consciousness of what they owe towards the being to which they have given life, it may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, of charity and of self-control, I was so guided by a silken cord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. Note the more elaborate phrasing here. Shelley doesn't write about the deep consciousness of what was owed to a son, but rather the being to which they have given life, which foreshadows and references Victor's subsequent own parenting, or lack of it, of his creation. The effect of this is to encourage the rereader to compare Victor's own childhood with that of the childhood he provides the being to which he gave life. In the quotation on screen, Victor makes it clear just how much incessant love he received. During every single hour of his early moments, he was guided and taught. Meanwhile, the metaphorical references to a silken cord emphasises the gentle, physical proximity between himself and his parents. They were always in close, loving proximity. Victor later goes on to stress that no human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. What a stunning contrast to Victor's reactions to the birth of his own creation. His first response is repulsion and to leg it out of the room. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. Even worse, astonishingly early in the monster's life, i.e. after a day, Victor refers to him as his enemy. Returning to his home in advance of an unexpectedly visiting Ingolstadt Clerval, he is momentarily delighted. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they expect a spectre to stand in waiting for them on the other side. When I became assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. The difference between how he has been parented and his own parenting is so extreme that it forces the reader to contemplate the morality and rectitude of his responses and language. The term enemy, defined as a person who hates or opposes another person and tries to harm them or stop them from doing something, is a ludicrous label to apply at this stage of the novel, when all the monster has done is appeared hideous, not his fault, move, tried and failed to express himself, and reach out to touch him. Indeed, his keenness for touch and inability to use articulate language liken him more closely, and admittedly rather incongruously, to a human baby, thus highlighting the disproportionate harshness of Victor's reaction. The clear impression is that the immature and childlike Victor has failed to give his creation anything approaching a fair crack of the whip, and thus it is no surprise when, later in the novel, the monster retrospectively justifies his creator's use of the word enemy through his systematic slaughtering of various family members. For in different ways, Shelley shows that both well-meaning, loving parenting, i.e. Victor's parents towards him, and utterly neglectful parenting, i.e. Victor towards his creation, can have potentially devastating consequences. For instance, even the best-intentioned parenting can end up facilitating an unwitting pathway to evil. In Chapter 4 of Volume 1, Frankenstein reveals that in his education, his father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not ever remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. However, does this mean that all too easily Frankenstein became immune to the horrors in collecting and investigating dead bodies for his evil plan? Similarly, and perhaps more pertinently, Victor's father's seemingly innocuous throwaway remark about Cornelius Agrippa, Cornelius Agrippa, my dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this, it is sad trash, only encourages his son to read the works of this alchemist with even more attention, thus helping to put him into a cycle of misdirected, obsessive, independent academic study, which ultimately results in his catastrophic scientific breakthrough about the animation of dead matter. So in spite of the best motives, Victor's parents' parenting only ends up producing a self-entitled, self-centered, dangerously obsessive son, forcing the reader to speculate that genuinely successful parenting may be more a question of luck rather than anything else. Or, put otherwise, that loving a child is by no means the same as successfully parenting them. To be fair to Victor, the story of Sapphi and her relationship with her father does suggest that a certain amount of opposition towards a parent's wills or beliefs can be both natural and healthy. Sapphi's father, known generically and within today's modern, more politically correct world, racistly as the Turk, orders his daughter to abandon her lover, Felix, and return with him to Turkey. Unfortunately, a residence in Turkey was abhorrent to her. Her religion and her feelings were alike averse to it. Sapphi thus decides to ignore her father and instead independently and resourcefully find her way towards Felix and his family, who are living within a simple cottage in Germany. There are some uncomfortable potential parallels that can be drawn between this event and Jessica's betrayal of her father Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, and in both cases the implicit suggestion is that Christianity must be superior to Islam, Frankenstein, or Judaism, Merchant of Venice. However, whereas Shakespeare encourages the more discerning audience member to reassess this apparent superiority through the disgusting crowing of a number of Christian characters, Shelley's interests lie elsewhere, and instead the reader is encouraged to praise Sapphi's loyalty to her betrayed Christian loved one, rather than disloyalty to her Muslim father. Some disloyalty to parents can therefore be justified. However, Shelley makes it clear that what cannot be justified is totally neglectful parenting. During the exchange between Victor and the monster in the Alps, the latter, who by this stage has already killed Victor's younger brother and framed Justine, cried out his frustration at his abandonment. "Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us." The implication is that the bond between parent towards child, or in Victor's case creation, should be seen as sacred and incredibly strong. They should be permanently and metaphorically linked by ties or silken cords, which should be impossible to take apart or bring to an end during their lifetimes. It is Victor's refusal to acknowledge one jot the crucial importance of post-creation responsibility, which leaves the monster feeling so enraged that he feels the only pathway he can take is one in which he gluts the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends. Here's how Andrew McCulloch, writing in the magazine English Review, puts it. Clearly, nothing in Victor's background, upbringing or education has prepared him for the moral responsibilities of parenthood. He may have an almost godlike understanding of the body, but he doesn't begin to understand either the mind or the heart. And of course, Frankenstein isn't just emotionally lacking as a parent, but in general as a human being. For instance, when thinking ahead to his marriage with Elizabeth, he anticipates the delight of a union from which I expected peace. Note that he doesn't suggest that they as a couple expected peace and happiness, just himself. This sums up his narcissistic view of the world and his utter emotional constipation. He simply does not have the tools to look at anything from anyone else's perspective. Why this is, we are never completely sure, but the niggling suspicion remains that overly indulgent parenting may have played a fatal role.
To sum up this section exploring the theme of parenthood, Shelley has Victor emphasise the happiness of his own childhood, thus making his first breath abandonment of his own creation even more unpalatable. However, in spite of a happy childhood, there are signs that in some ways Victor's parents may have unwittingly facilitated his obsessive, unhealthy rise to the status of demon creator. Shelley also shows the importance of parenthood in helping all living creatures settle to ordinary, mundane existences. One of the monster's great burning frustrations is that unlike any other creature, he is utterly alone. It is Victor's total neglect of his creation and his general refusal to take any responsibility for its life, which results in the latter setting upon his infernal path of terrible revenge. Finally, the story of Sapphi and Felix highlights the fact that in certain situations, disobedience towards a parent's will can be natural and rather a good thing. Oh, hello there. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production, exploring the themes of love, nature and parenthood. Many thanks. for watching.